Vikings emerged from Scandinavia, raiding from Scotland to the Caspian Sea. Modern archaeology and science reveal new insights into their motives. Long before their infamous attacks on Christian monasteries, early Vikings were already engaging in violent conflicts. Excavations in Estonia uncovered mass graves of warriors from the 8th century, suggesting that Viking raids began earlier than previously believed. These early Norsemen were driven not just by greed, but by survival, competition, and the harsh conditions of their homeland. The Viking Age officially began in 793 with a brutal assault on the monastery of Lindisfarne, shocking Christian Europe. However, the raids were more than just acts of savagery. They were strategic. Scandinavia's population was growing, and its resources were limited. Young warriors sought wealth, land, and adventure, while rulers used raids to expand their influence. Vikings weren't just raiders, they were traders and explorers. They established trade routes stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Middle East, exchanging furs, slaves, and silver. In the 9th century, they founded settlements in Ireland, England, and even as far as modern-day Russia, where they played a key role in shaping the Kievan Rus state. In England, Viking armies, known as the Great Heathen Army, launched full-scale invasions. They captured York in 866 and controlled large parts of the country. However, their dominance was challenged by King Alfred the Great of Wessex, who ultimately defeated them and forced some Vikings to settle and adopt Christianity. Meanwhile, Vikings also ventured east, reaching Constantinople and serving as elite guards for Byzantine emperors. Over time, they transitioned from raiders to rulers, establishing dynasties in Normandy, Kiev, and even Sicily. By the year 1000, the Viking era of conquest faded as they assimilated into European societies, but their legacy of exploration, warfare, and innovation endured. The Viking raids that ravaged England between the 8th and 11th centuries were not just seen as acts of war, they were often interpreted as divine punishment. Starvation, natural disasters, and religious beliefs played a significant role in shaping this perception. During the early medieval period, England faced frequent food shortages due to poor harvests, harsh winters, and inefficient agricultural practices. Starvation weakened the population, leaving communities vulnerable to Viking attacks. As monasteries and villages struggled to survive, the sudden appearance of Norse raiders added to the despair, reinforcing the belief that these attacks were not merely human acts, but signs of divine wrath. Natural disasters further fueled this fear. Unpredictable storms, flooding, and plagues devastated England in the years leading up to and during the Viking invasions. People saw these events as omens, believing they were being punished for their sins. The violent and destructive nature of Viking raids seemed to align with biblical warnings of divine retribution. Church leaders emphasized this view, preaching that the attacks were a test of faith or a consequence of moral decay. Religious beliefs deeply influenced how the English perceived the Vikings. The Norse raiders were pagan warriors, worshipping gods like Odin and Thor, and their attacks often targeted Christian monasteries, the centers of learning, culture, and wealth. The destruction of sacred sites like Lindisfarne in 793 horrified Christian monks who recorded the events as apocalyptic punishments sent by God. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and other historical texts describe the raids as divine chastisement, urging the faithful to repent. However, from a historical perspective, Viking raids were driven by economic and political factors. Scandinavia's growing population, competition for resources, and the lure of wealth from English monasteries motivated the attacks. While religious leaders framed the raids as acts of divine punishment, they were, in reality, part of a broader pattern of expansion, trade, and warfare. Despite their brutal reputation, the Vikings left a lasting impact on England, shaping its culture, language, and governance. Yet, for those who lived through the chaos, the fear of divine punishment remained as real as the Vikings' swords themselves. Archaeological excavations in Estonia have revealed a chilling discovery: 2 Viking burial ships containing the remains of 40 mutilated individuals. This find, dating back to the early 8th century, predates the first recorded Viking raids and challenges traditional timelines of Viking expansion. The burial ships were uncovered on the island of Saaremaa, a strategic location in the Baltic Sea. The site suggests a violent encounter, as many of the skeletal remains exhibit signs of brutal injuries. Some bodies bear marks of sword wounds, while others appear to have been executed. The presence of weapons, shields, and other grave goods hints at a high-status warrior class, possibly Scandinavian in origin. This discovery raises significant questions about early Viking movements. Traditionally, Viking history begins with the infamous raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD. However, the Estonian burial site suggests that Scandinavian warriors were engaging in seaborne conflicts much earlier. These individuals may have been part of exploratory raiding parties or involved in territorial disputes long before the Viking Age officially began. The mutilation of the bodies indicates ritualistic elements or a brutal display of power. Some scholars suggest that the buried warriors were victims of a battle between rival Norse factions or conflicts with local Baltic tribes. The presence of ship burials, a known Norse tradition, further solidifies the connection to Viking culture, despite the earlier time frame. This discovery reshapes our understanding of Viking history, revealing that Scandinavian maritime warfare and raiding activities were already underway before recorded history acknowledged them. The burial ships in Estonia serve as a haunting testament to an era of violence, expansion, and shifting power in Northern Europe, providing new insights into the complex origins of Viking warfare. Recent discoveries are challenging long-held beliefs about the Viking Age. New evidence suggests that Viking-style raids took place at least a century earlier than previously recorded, forcing historians to reconsider the timeline of Norse expansion. Traditionally, the Viking Age is said to have begun in 793 AD with the infamous raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne, off the coast of England. This event marked the first recorded instance of Viking aggression in historical texts. However, archaeological findings, including weapon caches, ship burials, and battle-scarred remains, indicate that Scandinavian seafarers engaged in raiding activities long before this date. Excavations in Estonia, for instance, have uncovered Viking-style burial ships containing mutilated bodies, suggesting a violent encounter in the early 8th century. Meanwhile, researchers studying trade routes and settlement patterns have found evidence of Norse warriors launching attacks and establishing footholds in regions far from their Scandinavian homelands well before the traditional Viking timeline. Additionally, ancient texts and inscriptions hint at Scandinavian raiders being active in coastal Europe and the Baltic region earlier than previously assumed. Some historians now believe that these early raids were smaller, less organized, and more exploratory in nature, setting the stage for the large-scale Viking invasions that would follow in later centuries. This groundbreaking research not only shifts our understanding of when the Viking Age began, but also raises new questions about the factors driving these early raids. Were they motivated by resource scarcity, political conflicts, or simply the pursuit of wealth and power? By uncovering these early Viking activities, scholars gain deeper insight into how the Norse world evolved into the formidable seafaring civilization that left an enduring mark on European history. As new discoveries continue to emerge, the story of the Vikings is being rewritten, revealing a far more complex and dynamic past than we ever imagined. Long before the Vikings were formally recorded in historical texts, Scandinavian traders and warriors had already begun establishing settlements along the major rivers of Eastern Europe. These early Norse adventurers played a crucial role in shaping the political and economic landscape of the region, laying the foundation for future Viking expansion. Archaeological evidence suggests that Scandinavian merchants and warriors navigated the vast river networks of Eastern Europe, including the Dnieper, Volga, and Don, as early as the 7th century. These waterways connected the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, providing vital trade routes between the Norse world, the Byzantine Empire, and the Islamic caliphates. Scandinavian traders transported valuable goods such as furs, amber, and slaves, in exchange for silver, silk, and other luxury items. The presence of Norse settlements along these rivers indicates that Scandinavian groups were not merely raiders, but also skilled traders and settlers. Artifacts such as weapons, jewelry, and rune-inscribed items found in modern-day Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus reveal strong cultural ties between these regions and Scandinavia. These Norse settlers, often referred to as the Rus, would later influence the formation of early Russian and Ukrainian states. Beyond trade, Scandinavian warriors also played a pivotal role as mercenaries and political influencers. Some joined the elite Varangian Guard, serving as bodyguards to Byzantine emperors, while others allied with local Slavic and Finnic tribes, shaping the power dynamics of Eastern Europe. This early Scandinavian presence challenges the traditional view that the Viking Age began with the 8th century raids in Western Europe. Instead, it highlights the Norse people's deep-rooted influence in the East long before their exploits were recorded in Western chronicles. By revisiting these early interactions, historians gain a richer understanding of how Norse culture extended far beyond the shores of Scandinavia, impacting civilizations across Europe and beyond. The Viking raid on Lindisfarne in 793 was a defining moment that sent shockwaves throughout Christian Europe. This brutal attack on the sacred monastery off the northeastern coast of England is often considered the beginning of the Viking Age, marking the start of widespread Norse incursions across Europe. Lindisfarne was a revered center of Christian learning, home to monks who meticulously transcribed manuscripts and preserved religious traditions. The monastery was also famous for producing the Lindisfarne Gospels, a masterpiece of medieval art and scripture. However, its remote location and wealth made it an irresistible target for Viking raiders. On June 8, 793, a fleet of Viking longships arrived on the shores of the island. The Norse warriors stormed the monastery, slaughtering monks, looting treasures, and destroying sacred relics. Survivors described the raid as a divine punishment, fueling widespread fear and religious anxiety throughout Europe. The event was recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and by Alcuin of York, a scholar who lamented the attack as a terrifying omen. The raid on Lindisfarne was not an isolated event, but rather the first in a series of Viking assaults on monasteries, towns, and trade centers across Britain, Ireland, and the Frankish Empire. It demonstrated the Vikings' exceptional seafaring skills, their willingness to use ruthless force, and their strategic targeting of wealthy, unprotected sites. In the years that followed, Viking raids intensified, leading to the establishment of Norse settlements and even full-scale invasions. The attack on Lindisfarne symbolized the dawn of a new era, one that would reshape the political and cultural landscape of medieval Europe for centuries to come. In the late 9th century, England faced one of its greatest threats, the invasion of the Great Heathen Army. Led by powerful Viking chieftains, this massive force of Norse warriors arrived with the goal of conquest rather than mere raiding. Unlike earlier Viking incursions, which focused on quick strikes for plunder, the Great Heathen Army sought to seize and settle land, permanently altering England's history. The invasion began in 865 when the Viking forces landed in East Anglia. Their leaders, including Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba, were said to be sons of the legendary Viking warrior Ragnar Lothbrok. Seeking revenge for their father's alleged execution by King Alla of Northumbria, they marched north and attacked York in 866. The city, a major political and economic hub, fell to the Vikings after fierce fighting. The conquest of York marked a turning point, establishing a stronghold from which the Norse expanded their influence. Over the next decade, the Great Heathen Army ravaged the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia. They defeated kings, burned towns, and forced local rulers into submission. Some Anglo-Saxon leaders, like King Alfred the Great of Wessex, resisted fiercely, engaging in prolonged battles and guerrilla warfare against the invaders. By the late 870s, the Vikings controlled vast territories and many settled in the lands they conquered. The region known as the Danelaw emerged, where Norse laws, customs, and culture blended with Anglo-Saxon traditions. Although the Great Heathen Army eventually fragmented, its impact was profound, leaving a lasting Viking legacy in England that endured for generations. King Alfred of Wessex, often regarded as one of the greatest English monarchs, played a pivotal role in defending his kingdom against the Viking invasions in the late 9th century. The Vikings had been relentless in their raids across England, and by the time Alfred ascended to the throne in 871, much of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom was under siege. Wessex, his homeland, was one of the last remaining strongholds that stood against the Viking onslaught. The Anglo-Saxons. He initially faced a devastating Viking army that had already captured large parts of England, including the Kingdom of Mercia. The Vikings, led by formidable chieftains, were determined to conquer Wessex next. However, Alfred's strategic thinking and leadership would prove to be the key to his kingdom's survival. One of Alfred's most significant achievements was his ability to rally and organize a defense against the invaders. He realized that traditional methods of defense were no longer enough to withstand the Viking threat. In response, he established a network of fortified towns, known as buzz, throughout Wessex. These fortifications allowed his army to regroup and defend against Viking raids more effectively. The buzz became crucial in mobilizing local forces, ensuring that the kingdom was better prepared for Viking attacks. In addition to fortifications, Alfred also reformed the military structure, creating a more organized and professional army. He implemented a system where local militias could be quickly called into action, and he introduced naval forces to counter Viking longships. His innovations in military tactics and infrastructure provided the foundation for the defense of England in the years to come. Alfred's efforts culminated in the decisive Battle of Edington in 878, where he successfully defeated the Viking army led by Guthrum, forcing the invaders to retreat and agree to a peace treaty. This victory solidified Alfred's reputation as a skilled and determined leader. His defense of Wessex not only protected his kingdom but also laid the groundwork for the eventual unification of England. King Alfred's leadership was not just about military victories. It was about ensuring the survival of his people and setting the stage for future generations. His strategic vision in both military and political realms profoundly shaped the future of England, securing its sovereignty and leading to the eventual establishment of a united English kingdom. Vikings extended their reach far beyond the shores of Scandinavia, venturing deep into Eastern Europe. By navigating the vast network of rivers that crisscrossed the region, they controlled important trade routes and established settlements as far east as Kiev and Constantinople. This expansion played a significant role in shaping the history of the area during the Viking Age. Viking traders and warriors traveled through the rivers of Russia, Ukraine, and other parts of Eastern Europe, establishing connections with local populations and engaging in both trade and raiding. Their strategic location along these riverways allowed them to dominate the region's commerce, particularly in valuable goods such as furs, slaves, and silver. They also brought their distinctive culture and influence to the regions they settled, leaving behind artifacts that testified to their presence and impact. In the area now known as Ukraine, the Vikings founded the Kievan Rus, a federation of Slavic tribes that grew to become a powerful state. The Viking rulers, often referred to as Varangians, played a key role in the formation of the Kievan state, with their influence felt throughout Eastern Europe. The city of Kiev became a central hub for Viking trade and political power, eventually becoming the heart of the Kievan Rus kingdom. In addition to their expansion into Eastern Europe, the Vikings also pushed southward, reaching the shores of the Black Sea and establishing settlements along the trade routes to Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire, centered in Constantinople, became a key trading partner for the Vikings, and many Vikings served as mercenaries in the Byzantine army. The Varangians were highly regarded by the Byzantines, particularly for their skill in combat. Through their extensive trading networks and military ventures, the Vikings significantly influenced the political and economic landscapes of Eastern Europe, leaving a lasting legacy that shaped the region's history for centuries to come. By the year 1000, the early Viking freebooters, known for their raiding and plundering, had gradually evolved into powerful overlords, marking a significant shift in Viking history. This transformation saw the Vikings move away from their earlier focus on raids and pillaging to a more organized form of territorial expansion and governance. This change signaled the beginning of the Viking Age's end and the rise of lasting political entities influenced by Scandinavian rule. As the Viking world grew more complex, many Viking chieftains began to seek stability through the establishment of dynasties and the creation of structured kingdoms. The violent, decentralized nature of early Viking raids began to give way to efforts focused on consolidating power in specific regions. This shift was largely driven by the need for resources, the desire for political control, and the increasing desire for more sustainable systems of governance. One of the key factors behind this transformation was the consolidation of power in Scandinavia itself. Over time, the Norse lands of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden became more unified under strong kings, who began to extend their influence beyond their native lands. The Viking rulers who once sailed in search of plunder began to focus on establishing permanent settlements, building fortresses, and creating administrative structures to govern newly conquered territories. The Scandinavian monarchs not only focused on military conquest, but also invested in diplomacy, forging alliances with other kingdoms and even converting to Christianity to strengthen their claims to power. This period saw the establishment of major kingdoms, such as the Kingdom of England under the rule of the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard, who successfully expanded his control over much of England, and the Heathen Rus in Eastern Europe, where Viking influence persisted for centuries. By 1000, the once unpredictable Viking raids were largely replaced by systems of governance, with Viking rulers solidifying their control over territories they had previously plundered. These newly formed Viking kingdoms contributed to the shaping of Europe's medieval political landscape, marking the end of the freebooting Viking era and the beginning of a new phase of expansion, rule, and territorial administration.